My name's Tiu Miner, and I'm a curator and writer. I'm from Estonia originally, but I'm based now in Rotterdam. And I also have moderated design talks. So that's also what I'm here for today. And I'm very excited to talk about the project of Marvin and Jasper, but also to expand it into the work of Julia and Marijn. And to also delve into the topic of ASMR and what that means currently in this pandemic, hopefully soon to be post-pandemic world.
We are Marvin and Jasper, and we've been working together since the beginning of 2020, and we are basically exploring through research and design a holistic perspective on the world, and we're trying to go really in and touch many fields like architecture, like fashion, nature, industry, and research design as well, and psychology with this project as well. And we started actually with another project called Membranes last year. And that project was basically a theoretical basis for this project that we have now, the Soft Talks project. The Membranes project is a audio-visual research essay for the GeoDesign online exhibition. And it was basically exploring the divisions that we are building up in our daily lives in society, but also in design through architecture and fashion. And how these changed through the COVID crisis, how these became maybe stronger also, how we were more far from each other. And that basically we translated now with the Soft Talk project also into public space and try to work against basically this desolidarization that is happening. So we asked the question, can whispering lead to more intimate interactions in public space?
We've got Dr. Julia Puerio with us. You are a psychologist, and we'd love to hear a bit more about what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a psychologist at the University of Essex. So I'm a lecturer, which means that I do some teaching, but my main interest is research. And one of the areas that I've been researching probably a lot more over the last sort of 5 years has been ASMR. So I got very interested in ASMR during my PhD because it is something that I've always experienced personally, but I didn't realize it was something that other people had. And then I found out that it was a thing and that there was all these videos on YouTube to trigger it. And I just got completely fascinated and thought, well, why is there no research on this? Because at that time, there hadn't been anything. So I set up a group and we started to look at the physiological basis of ASMR. So looking at kind of bodily responses to ASMR stimuli.
The physical response that you get from ASMR is very similar to the response that you get from touching each other, releasing the same hormone into the body, the hormone oxytocine.
This kind of synesthetic type experience that ASMR is, in the sense that it's sound and visual input being translated into a tactile sensation. And it's, you know, it's really interesting for me the way that this happens. Like, so how does sound translate to a tactile experience? It's really weird if you think about it. Yeah. But, you know, that element of touching stuff, engaging with materials and, you know, being touched is the main ASMR trigger. People just forget that it's that because they see all this content online. So they assume it's just whispering. But actually, when the research we've done shows that being touched is the thing that triggers ASMR the most. So we sometimes forget about that because it has been taken into this online world. So I think that's one of the real benefits of combining the online with the real spaces, that you can then capitalize on touch.
Next, we've got Marvin Brill. Marvin, you're a designer and you're looking at how to translate cultural events into digital spaces and what that means. Would you mind telling us a bit more about your practice and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm originally educated as a designer, but now also entering the field of curation and the research that I think is a bit of both in that sense. And I've been researching this idea of how events translate to the internet. That ranges, of course, from exhibitions to conferences to things that are very artistic to things that are way more commercial, maybe, and how that looks like once you bring that to a digital version of that original event. And that's part of a larger project of Institute of Network Cultures, where different Dutch partners in the cultural fields are exploring how they can do that in a way that actually remains interesting, and how they can have an event that still has this liveness that you could have if you would be in person, and that is still interactive in same ways that you could have be interactive if you would just be in a room with a bunch of people. And specifically within that, I'm looking at the metaphors that are part of those translations, because we often need something to tie us into something that we understand, which often then becomes a physical reality that we borrow ideas of.
We started working visually on the metaphor of the microchip. So the microchip is actually connecting people in a digital space, but we also wanted to translate it into a physical space.
Just the way how our computer works, there's this skeuomorphism that every single app has an icon that relates to something that is physical. So our note app looks like a notebook, whereas it doesn't really have to at all. And I think you also see this within a lot of different events where, for example, during Impact Festival, which was a completely online festival, normally it's based in Utrecht, they had this analogy of a flat. So there would be different floors, and then the top floor had a rooftop bar where you could go and chill with other people and have a drink or hang out, although that was actually in Zoom. So I think we often need these kind of ways to then understand how something can be spatial or how something can be similar to how we're used to a physical environment to be like. Another example, of course, was Ars Electronica last year, where there was something happening on site in Linz itself, but most of it was online and hosted by different partners. And then they had this analogy of a satellite that different satellites orbited around Linz as the main location. So I think there's a lot of these different kind of forms of storytelling to how we understand things that are actually maybe more ephemeral or just more difficult for us to categorize and to know how that really works. And I think the interesting with whispering in installation is that that's something that of this idea of sound, of course, comes back in our online communication. And of course, you can send someone a voice message, or you can listen to ASMR online, or you'll watch TV, but often internet-based things are a bit more text-based. But then this whispering gets this materiality in a sense as well. So in that sense, that even if you look, for example, I think within the installation, there's this element of text to speech where you would have something that is more ephemeral because it's just that particular moment. That turns into something that's speech that, to me, read almost like a chat box, as if someone would type something in and then leaves a comment, or this idea of chat roulette, for example, where you can meet with random people and likely going to be a mess, but at least this randomness is in there. And I think that's something that's what actually came back in a lot of different conversations. I talked with a couple of designers who presented their work during Dutch Design Week, who felt that they needed this randomness to, if you're showing your work, you want people to pass by and say something strange, or you want to meet someone you wouldn't really expect to meet. And that often misses, because if you have an online event, you have to program that technically, because you have to facilitate, for example, a rooftop bar. But you also have to really program that socially in the terms of that you make space and that you kind of encourage people to get together.
So, for example, when we did our ASMR live event, we didn't know whether it was something that people would enjoy or not. So we had kind of two predictions about it. The first being that actually people won't enjoy it. They won't get as much ASMR because they're around other people, and ASMR is quite often a very intimate thing. It most people, when they engage with ASMR content, they do so on their own in a nice room in their house, probably before they're going to bed. But on the other hand, we thought, well, maybe the kind of interpersonal and group dynamics might facilitate ASMR in some way because of the opportunity for emotional contagion. So quite often you see kind of emotions spreading through groups. A really good example would be something like a sports match, and your personal emotion is enhanced because there are other people there and the emotions spreading between people. It's really interesting to think about the transition from public to private back to public again. So I think most people who experience ASMR will have experienced it in real life, and then it's kind of moved into the online digital sphere with all these YouTube videos, and now it's really amazing to start to see it being translated back into real life with live performances, things like Marvin and Jasper have done, you know, this really nice nod to ASMR and connecting people in a time when we're not, you know, very connected. And there's also, you know, various different things about ASMR spas and, you know, lots of things. So I think this is part of a trend that's kind of moving us towards putting this content back to where it came from.
It reminds me of how we often like to think of the internet as a public space. It's like a town square and people get together, strangers, and they talk. And then, of course, the reality is that the internet is maybe more like a mall or something where there's just a bunch of advertisements and you're getting scammed into buying stuff you don't need. But that this ideal is very much, I think, present in the installation of the public space of getting together and using these different forms of either two-way communication or just leaving behind a message. Or I very much see that internet analogy in that setup as well. Of course, the network that's on the floor of these copper wires. Similar to how we would visualize networks as nodes and lines.
So in terms of misophonia, so misophonia literally means hatred of sound. So it's maybe it's kind of potentially considered the opposite of ASMR, but the picture isn't as clear as that. So misophonia is something, it's a condition which is relatively newly defined and described, but it encompasses kind of negative reactions and quite often anger and rage to certain common sounds, like the sound of somebody eating, the sound of somebody breathing, pen clicking, even somebody's leg wobbling up and down. So these kind of irritating visual and auditory things that happen in everyday life. Most of them are sort of produced by humans. And what's interesting is this seems to kind of be the opposite of ASMR, because ASMR is, you know, very pleasant, relaxing sensation that is being triggered in people, often with triggers that might induce misophonia. So things like eating sounds are quite common, whispering, breathing sounds, mouth sounds. But what's interesting is that ASMR and misophonia seem to be connected. So if you experience ASMR, you're more likely to experience misophonia and vice versa. And we think this is because both of these conditions are underlined by a heightened sensory sensitivity, particularly to sound. So it's that people are just more sensitive to differences in kind of acoustic properties, and that can then get translated into emotional experience.
The cone, it amplifies the sounds of the environment. And like that, you get aware of all the sounds that are happening actually in the environment that you usually don't notice.
Background sounds that we might not necessarily be aware of, and the impact of those sounds on our well-being. So sound is something that is very intimately connected to positive well-being, and people think about kind of listening to music. You know, the arts are quite often for kind of increasing well-being, but there also is the downside of some sounds which you may not necessarily be aware of, like traffic and things like that, which can impact you negatively.
So we installed these the tube with the two cones at each end, and like that people could have a conversation with a secure social distance. So basically we inverted the idea of communication. So we asked the question, when does it get more interesting to be more distant while communicating? And then we translated tin can telephone into the tubes.
Connecting in an intimate way when it's not possible to do so in real time. So what I find really interesting is the fact that you can basically whisper at a distance, and that's not something that we can really do in these times. So it's quite nice of connecting people in intimate ways, even in this realm of kind of social distancing. So there was, lots to like about it in terms of how it fits with ASMR stuff, but also more generally, I think it's brilliant. There's definitely a nostalgic element to this kind of, whispering with somebody. It's something that you quite often see in parks and things like that. And in terms of how that relates to ASMR, a lot of the triggers that people often report are quite nostalgic in terms of their first experiences of having ASMR. So it might be a teacher explaining something very carefully, or watching a friend colour something in, or getting your head checked for lice at school. So quite a lot of nostalgic triggers are kind of embedded within the ASMR world.
Yeah, it's a more intimate sense than our visual sense. So it talks to maybe a broader range of people. And I think, especially because of that, it's sad that we didn't include it that much yet in public space. Yeah.
So there was no door or anything. So theoretically, everybody could just walk on that place and use the installation.
In a sense, the people who participate also become performers through the fact that they are talking and they're being seen through the CCTV cameras. So in a sense, they enter that stage of the public sphere that is being live streamed, where other people might first watch and see someone else do something before they try to engage themselves. And I think specifically in your installation, you kind of turn the gaze around. Normally you would be watching the person who makes the sounds in those YouTube videos, but now you're watching the people who receive the sounds. So it's completely the opposite kind of gaze, I think, as such. So maybe that can help in formulating the question. What happens once we turn the gaze around between from looking at the ASMR performer to the receiver?
I think I would be really interested in hearing people's thoughts on kind of the dichotomy between like a public space versus an intimate experience, and maybe a sensual experience, and striking that balance, because that's something that I think is quite tricky. Because intimacy requires vulnerability, I think, quite often. And there's something about ASMR that is intimate, but you're not vulnerable because you're at home in your own space and you're listening to it on a computer. Whereas if you translate that into a public space, does that make you feel more vulnerable? And how does that affect intimacy?
I also, I know that the people who are producing ASMR, in some sort of way, they're engaging with an act of care and caring. And I wonder what it actually means for them to then make it into this more public interaction. Does it require more emotional energy from them? Is there a difference there? Do they maybe feel less attached to what they're producing? That's also something that I was wondering.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think there's a lot of emotional labor that goes into being an ASMR content creator, and that's largely to do with the amount of people that want to try and interact with them and form a sort of parasocial attachment. So there is, I wouldn't want to do it, but some of them have like millions of subscribers and they're having to deal with, these people who think that they know them. So I think it can be quite difficult.
You basically created something very interactive, which, because of the time that we're in, which is a pandemic time, is quite difficult to pull off in a public space. But then also the way that it's informed by something that is very inherent to our interactions with other human beings, but then still has been sort of emphasized on digital platforms, but it still informs your very physical design. It's a really interesting link between all of these fields and sort of ways of existing and communicating in a complicated 21st century.